Let me share with you what I consider to be one of the more profound thoughts I've had recently. Maybe you won't agree, but that's okay. What I have been doing in the process of looking at us as Americans historically, and the presidency in particular, is considering all of our past presidents for the last 120 years and looking at their positive and negative characteristics, their traits, and also looking at what kind of linkage they had to the dark side, to the dark forces, and how they got that way, whether or not they were always like that, or whether they were drawn into it, or twisted into it, or simply oblivious of it, and trying to figure out whether or not something has changed in the atmosphere that we have today with Trump as president. How does Trump fit into the process? Commonly among folks of our ilk, that is, people who are looking for a monumental change in the direction of this country, we are hopeful and looking to Trump to be that change, to be the source of the change, the center of the change, or the spearhead of it at the very least. And so what I've looked at is, how does this fit, and how could it be made to fit, and what is it that causes me to be hopeful or depressed or positive or negative? And what I will say to you is I came away very positive, and let me share with you why. So I ended up doing a comparison, and the comparison is, this will make the liberals crazy, and it may make a lot of other people crazy as well. The comparison is between, which it has to be, okay? The comparison has to be between Trump and JFK. And I say that because JFK was the only one since God knows when who actively looked at and worked to change the course of history. None of the rest of them have looked at changing the course of history. I think Reagan wanted to. He was aligned with, forced into and aligned with H.W. Bush, who was working behind the scenes against him from day one, and probably, God, why don't you go after me on this one, H.W., so we can go to court and find out what the truth is. And probably the Hinckley thing was manufactured by H.W. Bush, either to scare the crap out of Reagan. That was the least acceptable alternative, and the most acceptable alternative was that H.W. would have become president, which is what he was supposed to be, right? So Reagan opted when he chose H.W. to pick his battles and to pick the big battles and try to change the course of history, knowing full well that he had an internal undertow right from the outset. He knew that. And I know that he knew it because he told an insider and leader of the California Republican Party exactly that at the time that they added H.W. Bush to the ticket. So how is it that Trump and JFK might be aligned? Because that's the critical thing. Those are the two in our history, in our known history, for at least 120 years, who have come in and said, I'm going to turn this upside down. Trump said it right from the outset. He was going to turn it upside down with immigration and with tax policies and with returning jobs and breaking down foreign trade problems. He also talked about banking, he talked about the military, and he talked about others. Kennedy was more circumspect about everything that he ever did as compared to Trump. But as soon as he got into office, he built up enemies because everything he did of substance was to tear down the system and the process that was ongoing at the time, and that many of us had no idea was actually going on. Both of them come from wealth. Trump, fairly modest wealth until, of course, he made money on his own. Kennedy from huge wealth from his daddy Joe, who made money importing illegal booze and then being ready for the prohibition to come down, and probably much more, aligned and linked with the mafia, and that's one of the benefits and or sticking points of JFK. Both of them come from liberal bastions. Kennedy from Massachusetts, probably at the time at least the most liberal state in the country, certainly the most liberal state in the country, and Trump, of course, from not just from New York State, but from Manhattan, from the center of the liberal source of urban life on the entire Eastern Coast. Both of them have had difficulty with women. Kennedy, legion problems with him. Did not marry and married the debutante Jackie, who was 12 years younger than he was. He was the war hero. He was 36. I think she was 24. Allegedly, Kennedy had 300 bedmates during his 3 years in the presidency. That's one almost every 3 days. That's pretty crazy stuff. Now, he was 40-something years old, and he obviously had a high metabolism for that kind of thing. He allegedly bedded foreign call girls, Marilyn, others. There were people in and out of the White House, and most notably Marilyn Monroe, and then even more pointedly Judith Exner, who was the mob guy's girl, introduced to Kennedy by Frank Sinatra, and and aligned with Sam Giancana, so there was this problem, and it would have been an explosive problem had it become public. There was this problem that Kennedy was having a dalliance with a mobster who would have used any information that he shared in pillow talk with Judith Exner if they had access to it, and they almost certainly would have had access. Trump, on the other hand, has been married 3 times, has dated some of the most beautiful women, as did Kennedy, has had pretty serious allegations. Does it bother me? Not really, but pretty serious allegations of infidelity, even in his 3rd marriage. So is it a problem? Yeah, it's a problem. Is it an issue of fidelity and perhaps trust? Yeah, probably it is, but it is also, I have a recognition that people with high libidos also make the most aggressive, most assertive, most engaging presidents. LBJ on the dark side, perhaps Kennedy and Trump on the brighter side. Both of them were famous before they were elected. Kennedy was a junior senator from Massachusetts, was a war hero, was a tough guy, a very charismatic person who basically shot to the top. He overran LBJ, who couldn't figure out how to win the nomination, and during that time, LBJ was more and more flabbergasted, more and more frustrated about the fact that this young upstart had taken his place as a presidential candidate and as the logical next president. Here was LBJ, who had been working the hustings since the 40s with a landside Linden when he stole his way into Congress, and then working both the House and the Senate all the way up to the top. Trump, on the other hand, is a media celebrity and had never held public office, but has had high visibility and has been involved with public figures, including the Clintons and everybody else, forever. There are some obvious differences, and one of the obvious differences you're going to get is that I'm going to hearken back to the election of, let's see, what was it, 92, when, no, it wasn't either, it was 88, when H.W. Bush was running and the opponents included Lloyd Bentsen as the vice presidential candidate, a guy from Texas, a senior political operative from Texas. And in the vice presidential candidate, H.W. Bush picked the least obvious person he could pick as his vice presidential candidate, a person who had absolutely zero ability to challenge him, and that must have been why he did it, because it doesn't make any sense, in Danny Quayle. And Danny Quayle was barely in his 40s, was, I think, again, a junior senator. And in their debate, there was a question to Quayle about, well, how is it that you could step into the presidency in case something happened to an experienced H.W. Bush when you're the junior senator and barely 40 years old? And Quayle responded that JFK had been his age when he had become president, to which Lloyd Bentsen ended the debate by saying, I knew JFK, and let me tell you, little Danny Quayle, you're no JFK. What Lloyd Bentsen didn't say was that Lloyd Bentsen got a free pass during that election because he was deeply involved in the savings and loan scandal, and the only reason he got to skate on the savings and loan scandal is that the guy who was in deeper than he was H.W. Bush and the family of the criminal Bushes. And so both of them got to skate. Neither one of them talked about the other one being involved as criminal elements in the savings and loan scandal. And we're not talking about a couple $1 million. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that they took out of the savings and loans, knowing full well that the public was going to have to pay for it. So, other obvious differences: Kennedy was polished, aloof, articulate, fine-spoken, and was not highly confrontational. Trump, on the other hand, is rough-edged, confrontational, boisterous, and outspoken. And Kennedy is a decorated war veteran, was PT-109 captain, was the skipper of the ship. If you wanted to test his mettle, you had to test his mettle. If there was any place where what he did as president can be found in the footsteps that he took before then, it is with PT-109, when he, I think, swam 7 miles, dragging an injured man along with him as he swam, and then went out and tried to get into the channel and to get the notice of ships that were going to go alongside the island, and nearly drifted away and swam 10 miles or so, 5 or 10 miles then. He was a serious protector of his own troops, and that is way more than commendable. It is a life and death thing. He put his life on the line for it. Kennedy was a veteran, Trump is not. Both of them have powerful enemies. And let's take a look at the list, because this is really important, and this is exactly comes to the heart of the matter. It tells us where they are similar. It also tells us, I am hoping, where they are different, and so far at least they are different in all of the correct ways so far. So Kennedy had infuriated the CIA and had made an enemy of Allen Dulles as well as others. He had fired, I think he'd fired Allen Dulles, bounced him out, and Dulles, of course, was very high visibility. He and his brother Bobby, who was Attorney General, had locked horns with J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover threatened all of the dark stuff that he had in his files and folders against Kennedy, and to the contrary, Hoover was coming up against the limit on how long he could be the head of the FBI, and J. Edgar needed to have a president who was going to let him continue, because power was all that mattered to him. Kennedy was not going to let him continue, so there was a huge problem. There was the oil stuff, which H.L. Hunt and Clint Murchison, the guys that collaborated the night before Kennedy's death, and they did collaborate. Well, why were the oil and gas guys angry? Well, because the depletion allowance had given the benefit to the big oil to the tune of billions, really, truly billions. And they were going to lose that capacity because Kennedy was going to remove the oil depletion allowance, which would have destroyed that plum. Billions of dollars of taxes would have to be paid by the oil and gas industry. The Vietnam thing, Kennedy had already signed an executive order to draw down troops. He had not announced he was going to get out of Vietnam, but he was certainly going to get out of Vietnam, and we knew that, and that he was waiting for himself to be reelected in '64. This is a year before that, and he was holding off because he, as the Democrat, as the less pro-military guy on the side of it, he was holding off because if he had said, I'm going to back away from Vietnam, he would have been called soft on communism, the domino theory, and the rest of that stuff would have been brought in, and it would have become a huge issue in the '64 debate. So he was holding off. Kennedy had betrayed the mob. The mob had signed off with Joe, with Daddy Joe, and they had produced, the mob had produced by giving Illinois, the state of Illinois, to Kennedy. And that was what tipped the election to Kennedy. We're talking about an election that was within 0.1% of even with Nixon. And it took the Electoral College and a narrow win in Illinois for Kennedy to become president, and that's all there was. So after Chicago and the betrayal of Joe's promise, the two Kennedy boys, that is Bobby and JFK, went after the mob and started actively taking them down, prosecuting them, and destroying their areas. The Cubans were wild about Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs and because of his perceived failure to have stepped in and benefited the Cubans, and the flip of the Castro regime and getting it back out. Remember now that happened in 1959. This was Bay of Pigs had happened in, what, 61 or 2? This was 1963. This is 4 years after the takedown of what the heck's his name? I'll think of it in a second. The Cuban dictator, and that Fidel Castro had taken over. So, and on top of that, the Federal Reserve, which is the kicker, was also against Kennedy, and let me go to it. So Trump, on the other hand, has the neocons after him, has the liberals after him, and guess what? He has the CIA after him, the FBI, and the DOJ, at least at the top levels, and we've been watching this. We've been watching people fired at all levels. We notice that they are even more actively engaged than they were with Kennedy during the pre-inauguration period, pre-election period, pre-inauguration period, and post-election period, post-inauguration of Trump. And that includes the senior executive services, the FBI, the DOJ, the CIA, and others in the intel community, and the establishment. But here's the deal, and this goes to the Fed Reserve. Trump is also, who was linked in the 80s and who was saved by the big bankers in New York, is perhaps betraying them as much as Kennedy did the mob. Kennedy also issued money separate from the Federal Reserve, and there was in process a place where he could have neutralized and or destroyed the Federal Reserve as an ongoing entity. So all of those folks are there. So what is Trump doing differently? And this is the other part of it. What is Trump doing differently that might give us a better result? Because we're a lot farther downstream, and things, frankly, are much, much worse programmatically and deep state. We're much, much farther along than we were in 1963. First of all, if the pattern is true and viable, Trump has picked his battles. He is not, unlike Kennedy, he didn't take on 7 different entities all at once. He didn't take on the military, the CIA, the Cubans, the oil and gas guys, the whole Vietnam thing. He didn't take them all on at once, and the mob. So he's appealing directly to the public, and that's something Kennedy could not have done. He had to work through the mainstream media, which was not as corrupt as it is now, and Kennedy got a pass for the dark stuff he was doing. I mean, the mainstream media knew that he had untoward affairs that were ongoing, and they knew that, and it was just a question you didn't ask. They also knew that he had serious health problems that were being hidden and that may have impacted his capacity to think clearly at times. I think Trump is unfolding this process carefully, and there's every evidence of that. We will know, and I will talk about this at the end, whether I'm right or not shortly. He has the military backing. Trump has the military backing, and that's something Kennedy did not have at the time. It is pretty clear from lots and lots of levels that Trump has the backing of the top echelons and insiders in the military. And he is benefited by the fact that he follows on Obama, who did everything he could to destroy, dismantle, fire, and take away anybody that would have had integrity in the military. And to the contrary, Kennedy came in behind Eisenhower, which was a big militarily was a big pair of shoes to fill. So, and Kennedy was going to have to buck the military with Vietnam. So, the other part about this, and it is very clear that this is the case, we're getting reports to the effect that there have been as many as 11 attempted assassinations on Trump, and that they have been so far quashed. But, you know, keep your fingers crossed. I don't want any president to be assassinated, whether I like him or not, or her, when the time comes. But he is clearly vastly more aware, Trump is, that he can be taken out. And it is a huge matter that Trump is conscious of that, has his back covered, knows who is covering his back. Kennedy thought he had his back covered. Kennedy thought that the Secret Service folks were backing him. If you watch the tape, the Jabruder tape, is that right? I'm not getting it right, but the tape, you'll see that the USSS backed away. The Secret Service backed away. We're called away at the last moment so that Kennedy could be shot without interfering without the imposition of Secret Service in the way. And it's just part of the process that was going. Trump, on the other hand, has that backing and has that coverage. And there are indications, and I can't put a finger on them, I couldn't prove it if I had to, that Trump has his own security service, which is also coordinating with the government, that may be protecting him independently of the government and giving him added backing. So the pieces there are different. So where's the proof in the pudding? Where is it that I may be right? And what I have to say to you is tomorrow, I think, is the end of the primaries for the midterm. I have been saying since the first of the year, I've been saying this about the Q stuff, I've been saying this about all the things we've talked about today, that if Trump is going to be the sheriff in Washington, D.C., Trump has to clean it out. He has to clean out Dodge. And if he doesn't, they're going to snipe at him from every hilltop, from the top floors of all the buildings. They're going to get him. And there's no more clarity to that. The Democrats, to continue the metaphor, the Democrats have said, just let us get a majority in D.C. and we will actively take him out. That's all we care about, is to actively take Trump out. and we're going to use every means that we can to do it. They have the mainstream media backing them. They have all the rest. They have all the money. They have the insiders. They have everybody but the military and Trump's own fortitude on their side. And so we know that if the Democrats carry the House of Representatives, that an impeachment action is just a matter of weeks or months after the first of the year before it comes to fruition. Whether or not they can impeach, complete the conviction of the impeachment in the Senate is a whole different matter. But if nothing else goes on, but that they're taking Trump out, the Senate is going to become very tired of it. And of course, the evidence is going to get more and more one-sided as we go along. So here's where this is. This is where the rubber meets the road. The rubber has to meet the road no later than the October surprise, okay? So when Trump talks about this is the calm before the storm, I'm telling you, Trump has to have a storm. There's no other way around it. Trump is the storm. If he is not the storm, he is gone. If he is not the storm, he is going to be part of, he's going to be right in the middle of the storm, and he is not going to have any control over it at all. So that's my comparison, and I think it is the most viable, active comparison between presidents that we have had in over 100 years, and it is the only viable alternative for peacefully changing the course of this government. So I give him my energy with my own misgivings, but I give him my energy just as much as I would if Kennedy were president again today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this is edifying in some fashion, and give a thumbs up if you like it. Thanks.